Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming out on this rainy and historic evening. I'm Adam Goodhart, Director of the C.V. Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience, and I'm sure that all of you, like me, are still obsessing a bit over that epic, divisive political contest, that high-stakes battle pitting two alternative versions and visions of America's future against one another. That struggle between two radically different men, one branded by his enemies as an out-of-touch elitist in the pocket of big business, the other condemned as an irresponsible populist demagogue whose misbegotten brand of populism threatened to pitch the nation over the brink of financial ruin. And of course, you realize that what I'm talking about is the 18th century struggle between James Madison and Patrick Henry over the fledgling United States Constitution. What else could I be talking about? And that is the topic of this second event in our three-part series, Meet the Founders. And for those of you, I should say, with a certain degree of election fatigue, who are expecting the next hour to provide some purely historical distraction, a blessed respite from any thought of current-day political fault lines, well, you may have another thing coming, because as you are about to hear, those fault lines run very, very deep. Our speaker, Dr. Richard Beeman, the founding father of this series of talks, will need little introduction for most of you, so I'll make it brief. He is one of the nation's most distinguished scholars of the founding era, longtime professor of history and dean at the University of Pennsylvania, and a senior fellow at the Starr Center. There's much more about him in your programs, but in short, I can't tell you and I can't tell him how grateful we are for his generosity as a member of the Washington College community. Thank you. Oh, actually, just two more things. Sorry. I know that sounded like a final applause line. So it's penultimate. So before welcoming Dr. Beeman up to the stage, I did want to mention a couple of upcoming programs that you won't want to miss. Tomorrow afternoon is the main event of this year's George Washington Book Prize celebration, which Dr. Beeman himself, of course, won 2 years ago. The 2012 winner, Maya Jasanoff of Harvard University, a wonderful speaker who's won teaching prizes at Harvard, as well as a fantastic writer who won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction this year, will be here to talk with us about her book, Liberty's Exiles, which is the dramatic story of the fate of colonial loyalists in the aftermath of the American Revolution. That program includes not just a talk, reception, and book signing, but also a demonstration by some loyalist reenactors, duck, when they come marching in. And for the full schedule, there will actually be flyers available at the exits on your way out of this talk, so please pick one up. And my final announcement is that this Meet the Founders series will conclude 1 week from today, when Dr. Beeman will be shedding new light on the most essential founding father of them all, our very own George Washington. And now, please welcome to the stage Dr. Richard Beeman.
Thank you all for, let me get rid of this. Thank you all for coming out on a nasty night. Like Adam and many of you, my mind has been darting back and forth between the 21st century and the 18th century. I suspect that some of you are disappointed about the results of last night, and I suspect others of you are perhaps not jubilant, but at least relieved at the result. But I suspect that all of us are really glad it's over. This has been a long, and pretty unpleasant political campaign. So much so that I think I mentioned to you that I'm just finishing up a rather big book on the coming of independence. And I am going to finish that actually in the next several weeks. It'll be coming out in May. And I had a list of the next couple of books that I wanted to write. In this past week, while I was doing my daily, I call it a power walk, but I've reached a certain age where I'm not sure how powerful my power walk is. with my walking friend, and I really decided that the next book I am going to write, and I am going to do this, and if Adam invites me back, I'll be happy to come back next year and talk about it. But basically, the working title of this book is "The Founding Fathers Are Spinning in Their Graves," and then a subtitle of a sort of 10 reasons why the dysfunction of our present political system is causing the founders such a great anguish. And it is a long list of things, much of which we've seen during this most recent campaign. So I will say that as I talk about these two political combatants, Patrick Henry and James Madison, those contemporary issues are very much on my mind. But I am now going to jump back into the 18th century. My lecture 2 weeks ago featured three men, John Adams, Tom Paine, and Thomas Jefferson, with three very different personalities and temperaments, but who each in his own way contributed together to America's first revolution, the move for independence. The lecture this evening, I want to leap ahead 11 years to America's second revolution, not as audacious, not as violent, and nowhere near as arduous. It didn't involve 8.5 years of war. But the framing and ratification of the U.S. Constitution was a revolution nevertheless. The Constitution's crafting during the summer of 1787 was revolutionary, and that those who gathered in Philadelphia, largely at the initiative of James Madison, chose to recommend that Americans scrap their duly constituted government, the Articles of Confederation, and replace it with a vastly more energetic central government. But when they had completed their work on September 17th, they knew that their revolution was a long way from being complete. Their draft of the Constitution amounted on that day to nothing more than opinion, and would remain such until the people of at least 9 of 13 states, in specially called ratifying conventions, endorsed their recommendations, endorsed them in what truly was America's first popular referendum. One significant difference between my lecture of 2 weeks ago and tonight's is that the two individuals upon whom I'm going to focus my remarks tonight never really did unite in common cause, never did find common ground. Not only did Patrick Henry and James Madison differ in their social and intellectual backgrounds and in their personalities, but they were never able to reach agreement, first, on whether the Constitution was a good thing or a bad thing, and later, once the Constitution did become the law of the land, on how the Constitution should be interpreted. In that sense, Patrick Henry and James Madison, as Adam, I think, anticipated in his introduction, might stand as exemplars of where we, the people of America, stand today, in fairly fundamental disagreement about the meaning of our Constitution. So, to begin to introduce these two gentlemen to you, let me begin by telling you what they did have in common. They were both Virginians. That's pretty much it. Writing in 1815, William Wirt, Patrick Henry's first biographer, described his subject as a veritable child of nature. I'm supposed to... this is my one and only PowerPoint tonight, folks. There's Henry on the right and Madison on the left. Actually, I don't know which one's supposed to be on the right or which one's supposed to be on the left here. But anyway, described Henry as a veritable child of nature, born in humble circumstances on the Virginia frontier and nearly entirely self-educated. Wirt had a pretty low opinion of the quality of that self-education, describing Henry's, I quote, aversion to study as invincible and his faculties almost benumbed by indolence. That was a bit of an exaggeration. Born in 1736, Henry was the younger son of John Henry, a man who, through a combination of hard work and a timely marriage, managed to achieve a modest degree of wealth and political influence in Hanover County, Virginia, in the Virginia Piedmont. He got very lucky by marrying the widow of a very wealthy man, and so by doing that, who passed away, and so when he did that, his social status jumped up a bit. While by no means a member of the political and social elite of Virginia, John Henry was, though, in a position to offer his younger son, Patrick, a decent start in life. Patrick attended a small country grammar school until the age of 10, and at that point, his formal education pretty much stopped. Although Wirt's assessment of his intellectual indolence may have been a bit unfair, it does seem that Henry was much more interested in hunting and playing with his friends than in studying. For all practical purposes, Henry's Henry's education ended at age 10. His youth ended at age 15, at which time his father sent him into the world as an apprentice store clerk, and a year later set Henry and his older brother William up in business as owners of a small country store, a business which they quickly ran into the ground. At that point, he married Sarah Shelton, the daughter of another moderately prominent Piedmont family. The Shelton family gave the newlyweds 300 acres of land, a modest farmhouse, and 6 slaves as a wedding present. Not too bad. But the farmhouse burned to the ground 3 years after their marriage. Henry was able to sell a few of his slaves and purchase enough goods to start another country store, but that venture also failed. Between 1757 and 1760, Henry and his wife lived at the Inn and Tavern operated by his wife's family, with Henry earning his keep by tending the bar and entertaining the guests by playing the fiddle. At that point, after successive failures as a farmer and merchant, and with distinctly unimpressive educational attainments, Henry made what would seem to us as the incomprehensible decision of beginning legal studies with the goal of becoming a lawyer. His legal education, even by the lax standards of the Virginia backcountry, was exceptionally skimpy. Depending on whose testimony one chooses to believe, he spent somewhere between 6 weeks, that was Thomas Jefferson's somewhat uncharitable estimate, and 9 months in his preparation for his bar exam. He presented in the colony Robert Carter Nicholas, John Randolph, Peyton Randolph, and George Wythe, the latter of whom was considered to be the most learned lawyer in the colony. All 4 of them were really very, very distinguished people. Henry's performance in his exam was dismal. John and Peyton Randolph signed Henry's certificate with the greatest reluctance, and only, quote, upon repeated importunity and promises of future reading from Henry. Nicholas finally agreed to sign Henry's license as well. All 3 men, though appalled by Henry's lack of legal knowledge, were impressed by what they called his natural genius, basically telling Henry at that point that although he knew virtually nothing about the law at that moment in time, that they were confident that he would in time soon qualify himself because he had this natural genius. George Wythe simply could not bring himself to concur in their judgment, but he didn't make any attempt to overturn their judgment. And as later events would confirm, the observation of the 2 Randolphs and Robert Carter Nicholas about Henry's natural genius would prove to be right on the mark. Although poorly educated and at that moment perhaps poorly disciplined, the force of Henry's personality combined with the passion of his public performance, would enable him to develop into one of the most successful lawyers in all of Virginia. One of the advantages he had, I should say, is that most of the judges in Virginia knew no law either. So when Henry was appearing before a jury, as long as he could, make a passionate argument, he was likely to win the case. So he really was very successful. Henry's oratorical gifts, whether unleashed in the courtroom before a jury, or on the stump at a local election campaign, or on the floor of the Virginia House of Burgesses, to which he was elected in 1765, Henry's gifts would become legendary. From 1765 onward, Henry's reputation as a fiery orator, a firm defender of Virginia's liberties, and beginning in 1776 as the first governor of the independent state of Virginia, his reputation continued to grow. Truly, there was no person in all of Virginia other than George Washington. Washington, as you'll see next week, he operated on a whole different level than any other man in America. But with the exception of Washington, there was no man in Virginia who could claim even half of the popularity among the common citizens of that state than Patrick Henry. It's important to note, however, that with the exception of just a year's service in the Continental Congress in 1774 and 1775, Patrick Henry's entire career of public service occurred within Virginia. Patrick Henry was, first and foremost, a Virginia politician. So now we turn to James Madison. His life leading up to 1787 could hardly have been more different. Born in 1751, Madison was 15 years younger than Henry. He was the eldest among the 11 children of James Madison Sr. and his wife, Nellie Conway Madison. The two of them combining their wealth made the wealthiest family in all of Orange County, Virginia. Even as a child, Madison had been unusually studious. As a boy, he left his parents' plantation to attend an advanced school in a neighboring county. After 5 years studying astronomy, French, logic, mathematics, and philosophy there, he returned to the plantation where he studied for 2 more years with an unusually erudite local minister, a time when Madison began to develop a lifelong interest in the classics. In 1769, at the age of 18, he moved northward to study at Princeton. He arrived at Princeton just as the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment were sweeping the university, and he immediately immersed himself in the study of political philosophy there. Madison zipped through his Princeton undergraduate curriculum in just 2 years, rather than the usual 3 or 4, and he stayed on another year to study ethics and Hebrew. When he returned to Virginia in 1772, at the age of 21, he was, however, in such poor health that he predicted gloomily to a friend that he would not live either a long or healthy life. And indeed, for the next 20 years or so, Madison suffered from a combination of hypochondria and poor health that made him a pretty dismal character. Unlike Henry, whose natural ease among people of all social ranks was an important part of his rise to political power, Madison's social life, at least up until the time that he seemed to have undergone the equivalent of a kind of personality a transplant after marrying Dolly Payne Todd in 1794. I really must say that for me, there are 2 different Madisons in terms of his personality and his social skills. The Madison before marrying Dolly and that after. But Madison, up to that time, his social life pretty much resembled that of a medieval monk. Standing, and this portrait doesn't really do justice what I'm going to say, standing only an inch over 5 feet tall, Prematurely balding even in his early 30s, he brushed the few remaining wisps of hair at the top of his head downward in what today we would call a comb-over. He lacked all of the social confidence that Henry so easily and eagerly displayed. He did have, and this is a story that I'd love to tell at some point, but maybe not tonight. He did have one romantic adventure in 1783 while serving in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. An amorous adventure with the 15-year-old daughter of a New York congressman. Her name was Kitty Floyd. And Kitty seemed attracted to the 33-year-old Madison. But Madison, by deciding that he needed to stick to his congressional business rather than following through on his courtship of Kitty, lost her to a medical school student at my University of Pennsylvania. The story of this really is pathetic. Jefferson is giving Madison romantic advice during this whole period. And then Jefferson saying, go for it. And Madison is writing Jefferson these long letters as if he were like, purchasing a house or negotiating a commercial contract. There was no romance in it. To make a long story short, he took so long in getting around, he never did propose to Kitty. He just kept, going through all these details, and then Kitty finally got tired of it and just ran off with this other guy. In any case, if Madison's love life was a shambles, his political career was slowly taking off. Beginning in 1774, he began to show an interest in politics, and by 1776, he was a member of the Virginia Convention, which drafted Virginia's first state constitution. But in some senses, he was very much a backbencher at that point in his career. Unlike Henry, Madison was a poor public speaker, and he showed a marked distaste for actually campaigning for public office, a distaste that caused him to be defeated in his first attempt at being elected to the Virginia legislature in 1777. But by 1779, the Virginia legislature did elect Madison a delegate to the Continental Congress, at age 28, the youngest person to serve in that body. Now, one might ask how Madison, given his relative lack of experience, his miserable oratorical gifts, and his distaste for political campaigning, how did he manage to gain election to such an important body? Certainly, some of the explanation lies in the fact that Madison combined extreme intelligence and truly diligent work habits. No doubt about that. But the more important explanation is that the Continental Congress was not seen by most Virginians as either a prestigious or a desirable political body in which to serve. The independent, sovereign state of Virginia was the wealthiest and most populous state in America's fragile union. And most of Virginia's politicians, Patrick Henry foremost among them, not only preferred the comfort of their homes in Virginia to that of Philadelphia or New York, but they also believed that the state capital in Richmond was where the action was. But Madison's service in the Continental Congress, a body which struggled because of the absence of crucial governmental powers. This government had no power to tax. It had no power to regulate commerce. It often went weeks, even months at a time, without obtaining the necessary quorum even to do any business at all. Madison's service in the Continental Congress would shape his view of America's future in an absolutely different way from Henry's service in the politics of Virginia. In September of 1786, a small group of members of the Continental Congress gathered in Annapolis, Maryland, as I'm sure you all know, to discuss the state of commercial relations among the 13 states. But in fact, the delegates couldn't go forward with their business. They didn't have a quorum, proof itself of the apathy and sad state into which the Confederation government had fallen. At that time, Patrick Henry was far too busy serving as governor of Virginia even to give a moment's thought to what might be going on in Annapolis. But Madison, along with another equally continental-minded American, Alexander Hamilton, Madison and Hamilton were determined to make the best of what was looking like a disappointing situation. They persuaded the few delegates who did show up in Annapolis to propose, wholly without authorization, that a general convention of the states be called for the purposes of considering amendments to the Articles of Confederation. In February of 1787, the Continental Congress reluctantly agreed to issue a call to the state legislatures to elect delegates to such a convention, although it did explicitly limit that body's charge to merely to consider amendments within the structure of the Articles of Confederation. Even before the Congress agreed to issue that call, Madison was hard at work. He undertook a self-study course on the history of ancient and modern confederacies, a project that led him across more than 3,000 years of history, from ancient Greece to the cantons of Switzerland. And then in April of 1787, he composed a private memorandum called The Vices of the Political Systems of the United States, in which he laid out all of the weaknesses of the existing American governments, both state governments and the Confederation government. And he also then laid out his thoughts as to the best remedies for those weaknesses. So, by the time Madison arrived in Philadelphia in May of 1787, he would be thoroughly prepared not only with a critique of the existing governments, but with a plan for a new and better one. The other vitally important preparation in which Madison was engaged was to persuade George Washington to attend the convention, something that Washington truly did not want to do. But through persistence and by sharing with Washington his plans for an improved central government, Madison was successful in getting Washington reluctantly to make the trip to Philadelphia. Truly, without George Washington present in Philadelphia, we would not have a United States Constitution. That is a story for another day, but I'm absolutely convinced of the essential George Washington. When the Virginia legislature voted for delegates to attend the convention, Washington, not surprisingly, received the largest number of votes. The vote was unanimous for him. Henry received the second largest number, with Madison receiving the fifth largest number, enough at least to ensure that he would be in Philadelphia to accomplish the task for which he had prepared himself. Henry, although by that time he'd retired from the Virginia governorship, Henry was busy moving his principal residence in Virginia eastward from Henry County. By the way, I mean, at this stage in his career, Henry's got a county named after him. There is no Madison County in 1787, but there is a Henry County. But Henry was in the process of moving his residence from Henry County to Prince Edward County, so Henry declined to attend the convention. And now we come to a large vacant space in our story. The story of what happened between May 25th, when the Constitutional Convention began its deliberations, and September 17th, when 39 of the 42 delegates signed the Constitution. It's a vacant space because the delegates carried out all of their deliberations entirely in secret. And such was their commitment to secrecy that truly not a word of their deliberations ever leaked out. The only reason that we know as much as we do about the proceedings that summer is that Madison, diligent, scholarly nerd that he was, spent all day, every day, taking notes on the debates in the convention. And then in the evening, when the other delegates were out at City Tavern drinking vast quantities of alcohol, Madison holed himself up in his room at Mary House's boarding house, editing those notes. Madison's notes really are our basis for understanding what went on in the convention. Meanwhile, Henry knew nothing. Had the proceedings in the convention not been kept secret, Henry, as soon as he learned of the details of the May 29th session of the convention, in which Madison's colleague Edmund Randolph presented Madison's Virginia plan, a plan which called for, among other things, the creation for a national government with a supreme legislature, executive, and judiciary. Believe me, had Henry known of this, he would have been on his horse the next day, riding up to Philadelphia to deliver, in the fiery, passionate speeches for which he was famous, a denunciation of the whole proceedings as a violation of the charge given to the convention by the Continental Congress. But Henry knew nothing of the events of that day or any other day that whole summer. It was not until September 24th that George Washington sent a copy of the proposed Constitution to Henry. No doubt anticipating Henry's reaction, Washington told Henry, and I quote, that I wish it had been more perfect. And then he tried to assure his Virginia colleague, and again, Henry is the only man in Virginia whose reputation was nearly equal to that of Washington. So Washington knew that he had to tread lightly here. Washington went on to try to assure Henry that the constitutional door is opened to amendments hereafter. But Washington's attempt at preempting some of Henry's objections were not successful. When Henry actually read the Constitution, he was horrified. Writing to Washington, and it's important to emphasize that even if you're Patrick Henry, when you're writing to Washington, you choose your words carefully and politely. So, you don't break into profanity in a letter to the general. But Henry writes to Washington, "The concern I feel on this account is really greater than anything I can express." And those were heartfelt words. And from that moment on, Henry threw himself back into the maelstrom of Virginia politics. As I said at the beginning of this talk on September 17th, the Constitution represented nothing more than the opinion of the 39 delegates who had signed it. It would not become the law of the land. It would not replace, or in Patrick Henry's view, perhaps indeed in the view of the Tea Party today, it would not overthrow the existing Articles of Confederation until the people of at least 9 of the 13 states added their assent to the proposal coming out of Philadelphia. The contest that followed, lasting nearly a year, was the first democratic popular referendum in the history of America. A referendum in which the American people, or at least all free adult males in America, obviously voting in the 18th century was more restricted, but I will say voting requirements in all of the states for ratification of the Constitution were more open and more liberal than at any time in America's history. This was a time when at least all free adult males could vote. They were asked to express their opinion on a single issue, either yes or no, on the proposed Constitution. In fact, Henry and a lot of others who had come to be known as the Anti-Federalists, they understood that the simple alternative of a yes or no vote gave their opponents an unfair advantage. For most all Americans, including Henry, thought that there were some problems with the Articles of Confederation, that it needed some changes. But they didn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater in a yes or no vote. When the Virginia legislature received its request from the Congress to set up an election for delegates to a ratifying convention, Henry, realizing that an up or down vote would favor the Federalists, Henry argued that the Virginia Convention should not only be allowed to propose amendments to the proposed Constitution, but that it should also be empowered to call for a second constitutional convention to consider those amendments before this new Constitution actually went into effect. So he really did have an alternative proposal. And that's what the convention would confront when it opened for business on June 2nd, 1788. By the way, George Washington, which is in some ways typical of Washington, because he knew that this was an intensely partisan battle in which the two sides might not be able to find common ground. Washington declined to attend the convention. He really did wish to stay above the fray. But the two principal combatants, James Madison and Patrick Henry, were ready for the argument to begin. As the convention got underway, both sides agreed that the outcome was too close to call. Although we don't really know Henry's state of mind at that moment, given his popularity in the state, given the absence of George Washington from the convention, given the extraordinary power of Henry's oratory and the miserable character of Madison's speaking skills, Henry may have believed that he was likely to get the better of the two in hand-to-hand or tongue-to-tongue combat. Henry was the first to attack. He spoke on all but 5 of the 22 days that the Virginia Convention was in session, often several times in the course of a day, and on at least one occasion speaking for 7 hours without stopping. During one of his speeches, as he was warning of the very destruction of America if the Constitution were ratified, a huge thunderstorm passed over the large theater in Richmond in which the convention was being held. This was open to the public, so there wasn't enough room in the Virginia State House, so they found the biggest venue that they could to hold this convention. A huge thunderstorm passed over with lightning striking all around. Many of the spectators commented that Henry had in fact conjured up the will of heaven to support his arguments. While some of the opponents of the Constitution focused on specific details, the Anti-Federalists are scrambling to find reasons to persuade people to reject the Constitution. Senators' terms are too long, senators' terms are too short, congressional districts are too large, they're too small, etc., etc. Henry's strategy was to mount a full-scale assault on the very principles underlying the new government. In his very first speech, he went to the core of his argument, to the core of his essentially Virginia-centric beliefs. Why was it, he asks, that such a radical change in government was necessary, given the general peace and universal tranquility that already prevails in our state? And why had Madison and the other leaders of what almost seemed like a conspiracy in Philadelphia, why had they found it necessary to propose such a radical change in the locus of sovereignty without notifying the people of America beforehand? Had he or others known of the plan, they would have raised their voices in protest. This government, he explained, is not a Virginian, but an American government. It is, therefore, a consolidated government. That word consolidation was the most often used word in all of the Anti-Federalist critiques of the Constitution. A large, distant government with power to impose its will on people of diverse cultures, economic interests, religions, etc., all spread out over a vast expanse of territory. It was an argument, indeed, that we still hear today. An American government, a consolidated government. Both of those to Henry were fundamental violations of the very principles for which Americans, or actually in his mind Virginians, had fought the Revolution. In what was probably the most emotionally effective speech that he delivered during those 22 days, he asked his fellow delegates to think back to the motivating force behind their revolution against British rule, when, and I quote, "the genius of Virginia called on us for liberty. On this awful occasion, did you want a federal government? Did federal ideas lead you to the most splendid victories? No. The genius of Virginia did and will again lead us to happiness. To obtain the most splendid prize, you did not consolidate. You accomplished the most glorious ends by the assistance of our country. And for Henry, our country was not America, it was Virginia. In the United States of today, most of us, perhaps not all of us, but most of us do identify ourselves primarily as Americans, not as Marylanders or Pennsylvanians. But Henry's world, not just Henry's world, the world of most Americans was very different. They'd fought a revolution to secure their independence for their individual states. They had fought a revolution against the idea of a consolidated government whose center of power would be located far from the homes of their citizens. The tide of history has subsequently moved against Henry's provincial view of America's future, but who's to say that if he'd gotten his way, that if the individual states had retained more of their sovereign power within a loose but slightly more effective confederation of states than that existing under the present version of the Articles of Confederation, who is to say that the people of America would have been any worse off? An example that I often use when making these points to my students, and I've been making it for many, many years, and as those of you know, I've taught at Penn for 44 years, so it has been many, many years. And over those 44 years, I've watched the evolution of the European Union, an incredibly fragile union of states that had not too long before been at war with each other, and watched that union become something like a real confederated union in which Frenchmen and Englishmen and Germans just as often refer them to themselves as Europeans rather than Englishmen. Now, I'll have to say, so I've been using this example, the gradual strengthening of the European Union, as a good example of what might have happened with the Articles of Confederation had it been allowed to gradually evolve. I have to say the events of the last year in the European Union have not been a real way of strengthening that argument. They're certainly, they're kind of facing the equivalent of the crisis that the Articles of Confederation faced in 1786, and we obviously don't know the outcome of that. But I think it is important to try to put ourselves back into that frame of mind that Americans found themselves in 1787. James Madison, in spite of his inferior speaking abilities, was able to counter, though not overturn, Henry's assault on the very idea of his Constitution. He was able to do so for three reasons. First, he was really smart. Second, he had already honed his arguments in favor of a stronger central government, both during the 4 months that the Constitutional Convention was in session, and then in the 7 months in which he had contributed so indispensably to the writing of the Federalist Papers. And three, and this would be Henry's answer, he lied. Now, whenever Henry railed on against a consolidated government, Madison would calmly say, "Nonsense. This new government is nothing of the sort. It's part federal, part national, in which significant power is retained by the states." In fact, I really don't believe that Madison consciously lied. I believe that he believed that he had helped craft a limited government with only specifically delegated powers. But that isn't the way things turned out. In the midst of this intellectual argument, Henry stuck with his strategy of trying to block ratification of the Constitution until Americans had agreed on a set of amendments more explicitly limiting the power of the central government. Toward that end, he and other anti-federalist members of the convention crafted a set of 40 amendments to the proposed Constitution. The first 20 were concerned primarily with the protection of individual liberties and would, in fact, eventually find their way into what we now call our Federal Bill of Rights. But the other 20 were aimed at limiting the power of the federal government vis-a-vis the states. Some of them were relatively trivial, but others were pretty strong. A 2/3 vote required for the passage of any law regulating interstate or international commerce. Strict conditions on the ability of the federal government to impose taxes. In other words, a kind of Tea Party Bill of Rights. Madison not only opposed Henry's insistence that these amendments be made a prior condition to ratifying the Constitution, but in fact, he opposed the amendments altogether, whether prior or subsequent. And I mean he opposed all of the amendments, both those weakening the power of the central government vis-a-vis the states and those protecting individual liberties. He did so not because he didn't believe in protecting individual liberties, but because he feared that any discussion of amendments would be used by people like Henry as a wedge to weaken the strength of the government which he had helped create. After the speech-making was done, it was time for the delegates to vote, and it was indeed a very close-run thing. On June 25th, 1788, the delegates voted on Henry's proposal, or I should say the Anti-Federalists' proposal, that the proposed amendments be adopted and be considered as a prior condition to Virginia's approval of the Constitution. The vote was 80 in favor, 88 opposed. Madison had barely avoided disaster. I'd note here that Virginia was only one of 13 states. But if Virginia had refused to ratify, it seems pretty clear to me that other states which had already ratified would have reversed course, and those states which had not yet ratified, and New York had not yet ratified, would not have ratified either. So Madison had escaped disaster on that vote. There was then a second vote, which passed by a similar count, ordering that the 40 Anti-Federalist amendments be printed on parchment and be passed on to the First Congress for its consideration. So the ratifying convention narrowly approved Henry's slate of 40 amendments. A moral victory for Henry, but in the end only that. He had failed to make those amendments a prior condition to the creation of a new federal government. Immediately after those votes were taken, a group of disappointed Anti-Federalists met to explore ways to prevent the new government from going into operation. They're basically going to, lead Virginia in a kind of secession movement. Henry, however, refused to join the group, saying, "I will be a peaceable citizen. My head, my hand, and my heart shall be at liberty to retrieve the loss of liberty and to remove the defects of this system, but in a constitutional way." So at this point in our story, Patrick Henry, though not exactly happy, is at least a part of the common ground that was America's experiment in liberty. While continuing to oppose many of the features of the new Constitution, he agreed that the appropriate way to achieve any change was through proper constitutional channels. But before I end this story on that happy note, I want to close with 3 brief anecdotes, and then leave to you the question of whether Henry and Madison were ultimately able to find that common ground. Anecdote number 1. Ironically, though he had strenuously opposed adding any amendments to the Constitution, Madison soon thereafter not only changed his mind, but actually took the lead in crafting those amendments. He did so for 2 reasons. The first, in his campaign for a seat in the House of Representatives in Virginia, he faced vigorous opposition from his Anti-Federalist opponent, James Monroe. I should say that Madison had, before that, hoped to be elected by the Virginia legislature to the United States Senate, the more prestigious body. But Henry made sure that Madison was not elected to the Senate. So then Madison runs for the House in his congressional district, and Patrick Henry made it clear that he was on James Monroe's side. The only way that Madison was able to gain election was to promise his constituents that he would support the move for amendments if elected to Congress. So that's the first reason. Reason two, once elected to Congress, Madison decided that the only way he could prevent men like Henry from using the amendment process as a means of basically undercutting the central government, the only means was to take the lead in drafting those amendments himself, which is exactly what he did. As you know, the final version of those amendments contained 9 items guaranteeing individual liberties and 1 item, the 10th Amendment, with that vaguely worded phrase that all powers not specifically delegated to the Congress were reserved to the states or to the people. So 9 of 10 were individual liberties. A vaguely worded 10th Amendment had some vague statement about state rights. Patrick Henry, when he saw the final version of the Bill of Rights, grumbled that he would have gladly traded all 10 of those amendments for just 1 amendment limiting the taxation power of the central government. Once again, in the contest between Henry and Madison, Madison won. Anecdote number 2. Almost immediately after the new government commenced operation, the administration of George Washington, with Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton taking the lead, began pursuing vigorous policies to stabilize American finances and to promote economic development, all of which involved the dramatic enhancement of federal power at the expense of the powers of the state governments. Hamilton's proposals, which were passed by Congress and signed into law by President Washington, began to move the federal government in precisely the direction that Patrick Henry had warned against. And predictably, Henry let out a howl of protest. But his protest, interestingly, was not against the Constitution itself, but against Hamilton and the Washington administration for violating what he now called the fundamental principles of the Constitution. In other words, as early as 1790-91, Patrick Henry, perhaps the most vocal and articulate opponent of the Constitution, was already using that Constitution as the equivalent of the Holy Grail, the standard by which good, liberty-loving policies should be judged. Whether his invocation of the Constitution as the true basis on which to judge sound government policy was sincere is open to question. In a very interesting letter to James Monroe in 1791, he wrote, and I quote, "Although the form of government into which my countrymen decided to place themselves has my enmity, yet as we are one and all embarked, it is natural to care for this crazy machine, at least as long as we are out of sight of a port to refit." I think even at that time, Henry knew that the new federal government was far enough out to sea that it would be difficult indeed to get it to turn back to port for that refit. So whether enthusiastically or not, he did become a supporter of the Constitution, or at least a supporter of his interpretation of that Constitution. Our final anecdote is the one that leaves me with a sense of puzzlement. During the years between 1791 and 1800, the one man in America who may have undergone the greatest change of heart about the nature of our Constitution was none other than James Madison. As first the Washington administration and then the administration of John Adams pursued policies that Madison saw as against the best interests of Americans, domestic policies that seemed to favor northern commercial interests at the expense of southern agrarian interests. In the realm of foreign affairs, policies that seemed unnecessarily slanted to America's former enemy, Great Britain, at the expense of America's former ally, the revolutionary government of France. As Madison watched these developments, he, in concert with his best friend, Thomas Jefferson, took the lead in creating America's first organized political party, the Jeffersonian Republican Party. At the core of that party's platform was the constitutional doctrine of a strict construction of the Constitution. In other words, an argument that one should adhere closely and narrowly to the meaning of those specific powers granted to Congress in Article I of the Constitution. And using that doctrine, Madison created a party platform that amounted to a repudiation of all of the unconstitutional actions of the broad constructionist Federalist Party of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and others. Indeed, looking at Madison's views by the time of the election of 1800, an election which pitted Thomas Jefferson against the Federalist candidate John Adams, it's hard for me to see too much of a difference between Madison's views and those articulated by Patrick Henry in 1787 and 1788. So what was Patrick Henry's response to this? In 1798, as the heat of partisan conflict between the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans rose to new degrees, Patrick Henry decided to throw his still considerable clout on the side of the Federalists. In March of 1799, Henry, who had retired from politics several years earlier, ran for and was elected to a seat in the Virginia House of Delegates as a Federalist, denouncing Madison and Jefferson for their unpatriotic attacks on first the Washington and then the Adams administrations. Thomas Jefferson, who had a long-standing and mainly personal animus toward Henry, a really nasty animus actually, responded to this by saying, "Mr. Henry's apostasy must be unaccountable to those who do not know all the recesses of his heart," by which Jefferson meant that those recesses were very rotten indeed. The conflict between Henry on the one hand and Jefferson and Madison on the other was never played out. Henry died 2.5 months later before even taking his seat in the legislature. The testimonies to him and his career that appeared after his death were printed only in Federalist newspapers, not in Jeffersonian Republican newspapers. Henry had thrived on controversy since his first entrance into politics, and perhaps it's fitting that such controversy followed him to his grave. Yet it's hard not to regret that Henry was deprived of the nonpartisan testimonial that he so deserved. Henry represented, for better and for worse, the extraordinary sense of pride that most Virginians felt toward their colony and later their Commonwealth. And Madison and Jefferson would truly have the last word. Jefferson lived 27 years longer. Madison lived 37 years longer. Ultimately, they, not Henry, would be the ones not only to shape the future course of American history, but also the historical interpretation of Patrick Henry's role in that history. And at least with respect to history's judgment thus far, it's not clear to me that Henry and Madison ever managed to find that common ground. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. I'll confess that what I really wanted to do tonight was to talk about what the Founding Fathers would have thought about our presidential election yesterday, but I'm happy to. Adam and I have talked about this, and maybe I'll do that some other time. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you have of past or present. Yes, sir.
Do you find any evidence, Pastor Henry, consulting with or collaborating with the delegates that have been to the convention and then refused to sign it, rather specifically George Mason and Luther Martin?
Yes. You know, in a talk that already went on too long, I already had to cut some things out. But it was really Henry and George Mason, who was one of the delegates from Virginia in the convention who refused to sign the Constitution, who'd been the one to propose in the convention the adding of a Bill of Rights then and there, and the delegates had rejected his proposal. Mason was really annoyed by that. So Mason and Henry were allies in this. So although they did have slightly different strategies, and so ultimately they kind of parted ways with Henry being the one to promote this idea of calling a constitutional convention. So Henry and Mason definitely. I honestly don't know. Luther Martin of Maryland was certainly one of the most vehement opponents of the Constitution, to say the least. I honestly don't know whether Henry communicated with Martin. My guess is no, just because Henry is truly a Virginia politician. He doesn't look much beyond the borders of his state. But good question. Yes. Anything else? Yes, sir.
We hear that the Founding Fathers pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Now, is that apocryphal, and could you imagine that being applied today?
Well, it's the last phrase in the Declaration of Independence, so the words are not apocryphal. This is not only the concluding chapter, but the concluding paragraph of the book that I'm trying desperately to finish. At the moment they said that, not only did they mean it, but they were really, this was an audacious thing to say. They were nervous about it. I mean, the idea of being hung as traitors was not a figment of their imagination. This was an act that no one in the world had ever committed. So that pledge, and those words in my talk last week, 2 weeks ago, I talked about the various drafts of the Declaration of Independence, and the Congress edited in particular the last couple of paragraphs of Jefferson's Declaration. But those are Jefferson's words, and they stayed there. I honestly have to say, I mean, I'll confess, I'm if not jubilant. In 2008, I was jubilant. In 2012, I'm merely relieved. but looking at sort of the depressing election campaign that we've just been through, it's hard to see many of our leaders having that kind of courage. But maybe they do, and maybe it is just that the obstacles that they face, intense partisanship as opposed to British cannons, are just as intimidating. Yes, sir.
When and how did Henry and Jefferson start drifting apart?
Really during the mid-1780s, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were not only in Virginia, but probably all of America, the two most passionate supporters of an absolute separation of church and state. Not merely religious toleration, but the complete separation of church and state. Now, I know actually Americans to this day argue about how high that wall of separation should be. But those two men thought it should be pretty high. Henry, in the politics of Virginia, led the movement to oppose Jefferson's bill for religious freedom. Henry was in favor of religious freedom, but he wanted a general assessment on all taxpayers for the support of all Protestant religions. So he was no longer going to just support the Episcopal Church, but he wasn't ready to embrace separation of church and state. And because Henry was such a powerful and popular politician, Jefferson and Madison had to fight for several years to get that bill passed through the Virginia legislature, where Henry's power was greater than theirs. So Jefferson started sniping at Henry even then. But it got meaner and meaner and meaner. And during the 1790s, Jefferson just really said some terribly nasty things about Henry, mainly his poor education, that he was all tongue, no head or heart, and so on and so forth. Henry was just not that kind of guy. He was more genial, easygoing, and he also, of course, Jefferson wrote 7 zillion letters, all of which have been saved. And Henry, if ever wrote any letters, threw them all away. So it wasn't a fair contest. Yes.
Did one have to hold property in order to be eligible to vote on the ratification?
No. Well, that was an important thing. Now, the federal Constitution, by the way, our federal Constitution leaves it up to the states to set voting requirements to this very day, which is why we had lots of controversy in lots of states, including my own Pennsylvania, about voter ID laws. And so each state set its own standards. In 1787, Virginia still had a property qualification for voting. In 1787, Pennsylvania did not. But the Continental Congress specifically stated that in this ratification contest, all free adult males, regardless of whether they own property or not, would be allowed to vote. So this really was like the first national popular referendum. So it's true women didn't vote, it's true slaves didn't vote, but this was the first time that we, the people, in a fairly broad sense, were being asked to participate. One more, yes, sir?
Does the contrast between the money these founding fathers spent to do this show anything with $2 billion?
Well, believe me, the first chapter in my new book on the founding fathers who are spinning in their graves is going to have to do about the pernicious effect of money. What's interesting, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were all sent by their state legislatures, and most of them, although not the delegates from New Hampshire then and now is the cheapest state on the planet Earth, and New Hampshire would not even pay the delegates' expenses. New Hampshire's delegates did not appear. Alfred Landon, I'm having a senior moment. Landon and Gilman, Nicholas Gilman and Alfred Landon, didn't appear at the convention until July 23rd because no one was willing to pay their expenses. So finally Landon, who had some money, said, "Okay, Nicholas, I'll pay our expenses." And they showed up at the convention. George Mason, in fact, is writing back home to the Virginia legislature and says, "Where's my money?" They're supposed to give him like $2 a day. No. That's the answer. Adam, did you want to ask a question, or was that?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I was so interested in your riff on the European Union as a sort of confederation versus a more integrated federal union. And I just wondered whether that is an original Beamanism or whether there have been people in Europe who looked back to this discussion in talking about how to frame a united Europe.
So one of the things that's happened to me in the last couple of years as I've begun to pose as a constitutional scholar, not just of the 18th century, but of the 21st, is that indeed I've attended lots of gatherings and conferences where people talk about comparative constitutions, and I remember attending about 3 years ago a conference in Oxford on the Constitution of the European Union. And absolutely, yeah, this is something that they had in mind. Obviously, times have changed in a lot of ways. The principal problem with that ever happening in America in the 18th century was this clause in the Articles of Confederation that said you required unanimous approval of the states in order to amend the Articles. And that proved just to be so difficult to do. And that, more than any other weakness in that charter, I think caused its demise. Indeed, the European Union has a similar clause, and now the European Union has expanded so vastly that that may become an even more crippling aspect of it. Yes, sir?
I've read that we can credit Hamilton with saving our souls from what has happened in the European Union when he assumed the Revolutionary War debt.
Yeah. Well, so one of the policies that Hamilton pursued, which got Henry so upset, but ultimately got Madison upset as well, was that when he put forth his financial proposals, he said, not only are we going to issue money and impose taxes, not direct taxes on the people, but mainly import taxes, to pay off the debt that we incurred during the Revolutionary War, but we are going to take over all of the debts of the individual states. And he knew exactly what he was doing. If he made the states dependent upon the federal government for paying off their debts, then it would make them dependent on the federal government for lots of other things. And that really was the first step in this great expansion of federal power. And Patrick Henry recognized it as such and opposed it. But you're quite right in saying that that was a critically important first step. Yes, indeed. All right, well, listen, next week, if you're still up for it, I'm going to talk not about Washington's whole life, but about the closing chapter in Washington's life, Washington's time as chief executive, a time in which, on the one hand, he made among his greatest contributions to our nation, but also the most difficult years of his life, I think. So I look forward to doing that. I haven't written the lecture yet, but that's what I'll be doing this week.